When I say everything should be determined by a market, people oftentimes get decisively irrational. You can feel it with like a pause, or maybe they squint a little bit, or they go, or they may even mutter something passive aggressive like, "There's more to life than money," and "Don't be so naive about human nature," or something like that. And this kind of response to saying that everything should be determined by a market betrays a colossal ignorance about what a market is. Because, well, what is a market? Well, there's a market of bananas. You have people supplying bananas and people demanding bananas. And so a market of bananas is just a description of human behavior in relation to bananas. And you can replace bananas with anything. And when you do this, what you discover is that a market is simply the interaction of individuals in relation to the goods and services they produce. And the production of stuff, or provision of services, itself is just the interaction of people. And what I mean by this is that people interact with each other in order to produce bananas. And a market is an interaction between this production and consumption, this supply and demand. And then a market can very simply be defined as nothing more than the interaction between people. So when I say everything should be determined by the market, I'm simply saying that everything should be provided and determined by the interaction of people with each other and, the material resources that they use. No shit, Sherlock? Well, when people call themselves a market anarchist, or, you have these communists calling themselves anarchists who then call the actual anarchists market anarchists, that's about as absurd as saying lung breather or liquid drinker. Right? You cannot accept or deny a market any more than you can accept or deny gravity. I mean, you can say that you deny a market and you can impose a totalitarian dictatorship on a bunch of people, but that's not going to eliminate market forces, right? You'll just have a supply and demand for political favors. And in fact, a market doesn't exist in objective reality. It does exist, but it is a completely subjective concept. It is nothing more than a model of the world. So it exists as a model of the world. Now this model is formed based on objective reality and is an attempt to explain reality without having to calculate the actions of every single person in the world. But it doesn't actually exist any more than a social force exists, or a herd exists, or a forest exists. Like if you take all the cattle out of a herd, you won't have some singular herd just standing there, right? And it doesn't exist in the same way evolution doesn't exist, right? Evolution doesn't actually exist, right? It's just a concept. And a market doesn't actually exist, it's just a concept. And many will say that we need to regulate the market, or that they don't want all their activities to be determined by market forces. This statement is as absurd as saying they don't want life to be governed by evolutionary forces. I mean, you can say this and you can deny evolutionary forces, but then animals will just evolve along a different line, right? If you take, if you say we're going to deny evolution and we're going to put all the cows in a square thing, well, the evolution will continue. It'll just continue along different lines. The same way, if you want to say that, I don't want market forces to continue, so I'm going to put the market in a box, well, then the market will continue. It'll just develop along different lines. Markets will always exist, and markets will always dominate. In the same way, evolution will always exist and always dominate. But when people say they don't want everything to be determined by markets, what they really mean is that they don't want everything to be determined by money. That is, if some guy dislocates his shoulder and can't pay for it, they don't want him to be denied the relocation of his shoulder and perhaps corrective surgery. All right? We all want a humane society, and most would be willing to give a portion of their income to provide for this humane society. And in this sense, people both demand and supply the humane society. It's part of the market, right? And you can have a state. You can put this market in a pen and say, don't do it, but it's just going to screw things up in the same way putting animals in a pen is just going to screw things up. Some don't like to assign welfare to a market. Like some people don't like it. It's just unholy or something like that. And they don't like to treat healthcare the same way they treat shoe production. But statists wanting to make welfare divorced from the market is no different than Christians wanting to make humans divorce from evolution. Right? Evolution doesn't make humans the same as chimps. It just describes how humans came to be. And markets don't make welfare the same as shoe production. It just describes how welfare came to be. And here it comes. We cannot rely on the generosity of people to provide welfare. We must have the state do it. What this means, of course, is that we must use the threat of physical force to get one person to pay for another. Often people will say, we need to use the state to limit the abuses of the free market. And this is a euphemism within a euphemism. All a state can do is use the threat of imprisonment or killing to get people, and remember, the market is just the interaction of people, to pay for the services of other people. And if that isn't bad enough, how will it be decided how much money is violently expropriated from one group of people to another group of people? Through elections, through others voting themselves each other's money, through a so-called enlightened oligarchy? Certainly these have proven to be disastrous modes of organization, as healthcare costs, adjusted for inflation, are actually higher across the board than in 1970, even for people like above the age of 65, who are supposedly the beneficiaries of the welfare state. And don't even get me started on education. And you can go into depth about why these things fail, but the real answer is a lot simpler than that. They are not based on people choosing and figuring out how to provide these things on an individual level, also known as the free market. When you have a problem, you try things, you make mistakes, and you try new things. It's the scientific method that we use to solve every problem in our life. But this does not happen when a government, quote, solves, close quote, a problem. A government plan is drawn up for whatever reasons. Maybe someone bribed someone here, or their district wants this, or whatever reasons. And then it gets violently imposed upon everyone else. And yes, there may be some occasional elections, but seriously. Imagine if we had elections on shoe production. Okay, shoes would become just another political psychodrama, and you'd have people picketing with a right to shoes, and you'd have political ads about those cruel candidates who want to cut spending on shoes and who want our children to go barefoot or something like that. And that's kind of silly, but this is what happens with education and healthcare. All right, and it's all because there's a general ignorance about markets. And for the political process in general, just imagine if long ago we decided to have government get involved in computer production, and we decided the managers of computer companies based on elections, and you'd have people run for computer czar, whatever. Imagine if we determined who was in charge of computer production this way. I mean, do you think Bill Gates would end up designing the operating system? I mean, do you think all these geeks would end up where they are? No, of course not, because the political process is not a rational one. All right, it's a popularity contest. And that's all fine, one may say, but altruistic ventures such as welfare and Medicare and all that stuff require coordination and standardization, and we need to avoid the free rider problem. And the free rider problem being that people who live in an area, and they occasionally get free healthcare, but they may never pay for it. They may never pay for the charities, and so they're just living off of everyone else who volunteers a portion of their income to charity. And this problem is dealt with in a state by just violently forcing everyone to pay. It's called taxes. But the thing is, this coordination of welfare services has been done all throughout history before the welfare state. Okay? There was never this shortage of education in colonial America. I mean, right up to when they had public education, there wasn't a shortage of education. It's just that it wasn't pursued by most people because the economy of the day didn't require nearly as much education. And I would be very surprised if poor people have easier access to health care relative to everyone else in 1970 when government was far lower. In fact, I would be interested if the bottom 10% had greater access to healthcare in absolute terms in 1970 than today. And I don't mean access to a list, I mean access to actual doctors. But if there was a shortage of healthcare for the poor that required more than just the charity of doctors and the pro bono work and the we will not turn away someone for for inability to pay. If there was still a shortage, even with Doctors Charity, and people demand that the poor receive health care, like everyone in society wanted the poor to get health care, then people can add additional fees to the homeowners association, right? That is, part of the contract to buy or sell a home is an agreement to set aside a portion of your income to help the poor in whatever way. And if some greedy bastard doesn't want to help the poor, then he can choose to live somewhere else, right? He can choose not to live in this group of people who wants to care for the poor, and he can choose to live somewhere else in a way that states that you can't do in the United States, because the United States claims like half a freaking continent and only uses a very small portion of it. Anyway, I don't want to go into a whole discussion about a stateless society, but I just wanted to make a little video about markets and how markets are more than just, dollars and cents and goods.